Recon Team Asp entered the mountains of Quảng Nam and then stopped answering the radio. No recorded firefight. No final words. Just a call sign that never came back. Days later, Captain Tom Harlan circled the same grid, cockpit hot, pencil pressing into his kneeboard, as static filled his headset. Below him, two figures moved signal panels in a break of jungle. "I saw them," he said later. "Weather closed the valley. The rescue never landed." Officially, Staff Sergeant First Class Lewis Clark Walton was missing. "I can't pretend to know what it felt like to fly away from people asking to be seen, but I know how that moment followed a family for decades, and how one handmade object refused to let the waiting end." Lewis Clark Walton had learned, over years of doing this work, that rushing only made things louder. Louder in the wrong way. So while other men moved fast, before missions checking weapons twice, joking too hard, burning off nerves, Walton slowed himself down on purpose. He sat on an overturned ammo crate just outside the hooch, boots flat on the packed earth, elbows resting on his knees. The morning air was already warm, pressing in, carrying the smell of wet canvas, fuel, and the sour sweetness of rotting vegetation from beyond the perimeter. Somewhere nearby, a helicopter engine coughed to life and died again. Walton closed his eyes. Not to pray. That wasn't it. He closed them so his hands could take over. Left cargo pocket, right cargo pocket, chest rig, knife handle, radio wire. He touched each item in the same order every time, fingers moving with a quiet certainty that came from repetition, not confidence. He counted under his breath, not numbers, exactly, more like beats. A rhythm. The habit had followed him from jump school to Korea to Vietnam. From night drops where you couldn't see your own hands, to jungle insertions where light was an invitation to be seen. "If I can feel it," he once said, "I know it's still mine." A younger teammate passed behind him and slowed, watching. Everyone knew Walton had his routines. No one interrupted them. You didn't mess with things that kept a man steady. When Walton reached under his shirt, the metal was already warm. The medallion slid into his palm, its edge smoothed by years of skin and sweat. Street Christopher, the saint of travelers, with airborne jump wings welded directly onto it. The weld bead wasn't pretty. It curved unevenly, darkened in places where the heat had lingered too long. Walton had done it himself years ago, back when he worked construction, back when fixing broken things was still how he explained himself to the world. The wings weren't regulation. The medallion wasn't issued. Together, they were unmistakably his. He rubbed his thumb across the raised metal, then flipped it once, checking the weld without really looking. It held. It always held. A man crouched nearby, adjusting his laces, glanced over. "That thing's gotta be lucky," he said, nodding at the chain. Walton smiled, faintly. "It's heavy," he replied. "That's better." He slipped it back beneath his shirt, where it settled against his chest, and stood. His knees popped softly as he straightened. 36 years old. Older than most of the men around him now. A husband, a father, a senior man in a profession that didn't reward age so much as it demanded it. He adjusted the strap on a teammate's pack without asking, pulled once, frowned, pulled again. It wasn't loose enough to matter, but Walton tightened it anyway. He fixed things reflexively. Uneven edges bothered him. Small failures irritated him more than big ones, because he believed quietly, stubbornly, that enough small fixes could keep something larger from collapsing. That belief followed him everywhere. Thousands of miles away, in a house that smelled like coffee and floor cleaner, his son sat at a kitchen table folding paper airplanes. Walton had shown him how the last time he was home, the crease had to be sharp. The wings had to match. If one side dipped, the whole thing spiraled. "So it flies straight," Walton had said, guiding the boy's fingers. "And if it doesn't?" the child asked. "Then you fix it." It wasn't advice meant for war. It was just how Walton understood things. That memory flickered through him now, unexpected and brief. A child's concentration, his wife watching from the sink, drying the same plate twice because she wasn't ready to speak yet. There were words Walton meant to leave behind this time. He'd thought about it during quiet moments, even practiced it once, alone. "If I can't be there," he'd whispered into the empty room, "I want you to know I tried to come back." The recorder stayed unused. There was always another check to finish first. At the flight line, the noise picked up. Rotor blades began to spin. the sound flattening conversation into hand signals and raised voices. Men joke the way they always did about coffee strong enough to strip paint, about someone's nickname that never stuck, about how jungle rot didn't care how tough you were. For a moment, it sounded like any other morning. Ordinary. Almost light. Walton slung his rucksack over one shoulder and felt its weight settle. He took it off again, adjusted the straps by an inch, then put it back on. Better. He moved with the calm of a man who'd done this long enough to know fear didn't announce itself at hid-inside habits. As he climbed into the helicopter, metal vibrating under his boots, he glanced once at the open door. The ground dropped away beneath them quickly, green swallowing brown, the perimeter shrinking to nothing. The air inside the aircraft grew hot and sharp, with exhaust and oil. Walton braced himself with one hand and let his eyes close again. He thought about the house he wanted to build when this was over. Not big, solid, something permanent. A house that doesn't move when the world does. He joked once, but he meant it. He imagined his son older, tall enough to cast a line properly. The two of them standing by a river somewhere quiet. When I'm home, he'd promised, we'll go fishing for real. The helicopter banked. The jungle rose up to meet them. Insertion was quick. Rope down. Boots hit earth. Leaves shook violently, then stilled. The aircraft was already lifting away as Walton raised his weapon and scanned the tree line. The smell down here was different, richer, heavier. Wet leaves, mud, life pressing in from every direction. They moved off the landing zone immediately. Walton counted steps without meaning to, tracking direction by feel as much as sight. He glanced back once, not from fear, just habit marking the place where they'd touched down. He rewrote the coordinates in his head, afraid of forgetting something that might matter later. That night, under triple canopy, darkness arrived early and completely. Walton checked his gear by touch again, fingers moving through familiar shapes. The jungle breathed around them, water dripping, insects clicking, something larger shifting farther off. Above it all, hidden by leaves, was sky he couldn't see but could imagine. He pressed the medallion flat against his chest, feeling its weight, listening. Somewhere beyond the trees, there were radios, helicopters, people who would answer if called. For now, they waited. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to carry that kind of patience into danger, but I can see how it settles into a man's hands, how it turns preparation into a kind of promise. Before dawn, Walton adjusted a strap that didn't need adjusting. Before first light, he checked the medallion again. No one commented. No one needed to. Later, when radio checks began to slip and routine began to fracture, Walton would already have done what he always did, tightened what he could, carried what mattered, and moved forward with a plan to return. A father left with a promise in his pocket. A craftsman carried something he'd made to keep himself anchored. And deep in the jungle, before anything broke, Lewis Clark Walton believed without drama, without certainty, that weight, care, and habit might be enough to bring him home. The first missed radio check did not feel like disaster. It felt like delay. Captain Tom Harlan was already in the air when it happened. His O2 lifting into the haze above Quảng Nam, cockpit rattling as it climbed. He chewed peppermint gum out of habit, jaw working steadily, the sharp taste cutting through the stale heat. His kneeboard rested against his thigh, grease-stained and soft from use, pencil clipped to the side. He checked the time, rewrote it, looked down. Covey calling Asp, he said into the mic, voice calm, practiced. Radio check. Static answered. Nothing else. Harlan waited the prescribed seconds, then tried again. Same words, same tone, same result. It happened often enough to not mean much at first. Radios failed. Terrain swallowed signals. Men stayed quiet when they needed to. You learned not to panic on the first miss. Panic made you sloppy. Still, Harlan wrote the time down. He circled once, then again, the aircraft banking gently, as the jungle slid beneath him in endless shades of green. From above, it all looked the same: ridges, folds, shadows that could hide anything. He adjusted his headset, listening harder than made sense, as if effort alone might pull a voice through. Covey calling Asp. How copy? Nothing. In the back seat, his observer, young, quiet, everyone called him. Kid shifted and leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the ground. The cockpit was loud, but there was a kind of private quiet inside it too. The kind that grows when you're waiting for something that should already have happened. Harlan circled again. Down below, Recon Team Asp was somewhere under that canopy. Men he'd talked to. Men with routines, with hands that checked gear in the dark, with objects they carried because they mattered. He didn't know those details then. He only knew the grid. He rewrote the coordinates on his kneeboard. Once. Then again. Afraid that if he didn't, they might slip away. The second mischeck felt different. Not worse, just heavier. By the third, the air inside the cockpit had changed. Harlan became aware of his own breathing in the headset. Too loud, too close. He pulled the gum from his mouth and stuck it under the edge of the panel, then immediately wished he hadn't. Superstitions were a problem when you noticed them. On the fourth pass, Kid spoke quietly. Still nothing. I know, Harlan replied. They flew until fuel concerns nudged at the back of his mind, then peeled away, the jungle swallowing the sound of their engine almost immediately. As he turned north, Harlan felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have language for yet. Back at base, the waiting took on shape. Radios were checked, logs were pulled, times were compared. The absence of response grew from inconvenience into dread. Line by line, entry by entry. No one said it out loud at first. You never said it first. That night, Harlan lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, the smell of canvas and sweat thick in the air. He rewrote the coordinates in his head, again and again, afraid that sleep might take them. The next day, he was back over the area early, the air cooler but already rising with heat. He chewed fresh gum. Kid adjusted the binoculars. They flew the pattern tighter now, eyes searching not for movement, but for meaning. Then, just after midday, something flashed. Hold on, Kid said sharply. Harlan banked instinctively, heart kicking once, hard. He dropped altitude slightly, angling the sun over his shoulder. There it was again, a reflection, then color. Down below, in a break where the canopy thinned, cloth lay spread signal panels, deliberate, not debris. And near them, movement. Two figures. They were small from this height, swallowed by green, but they moved with intention. One bent, adjusted the panel. The other stepped back, then forward again. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were trying to be seen. I've got eyes, Harlan said, already reaching for the mic. I see them. His voice stayed level, but his hand shook slightly. As he marked the time, he felt something close to joy, cut through the tension sharp. Dangerous. Covey to bright light, he called. We have visual signal. Two individuals, panels in the open. Kid leaned forward, almost pressing against the canopy glass. They're waving, he said, then softer. They want us to see. Harlan nodded, though Kid couldn't see it. He circled, careful not to lose the spot, heart beating too fast now. He imagined the men below hearing the aircraft, looking up, counting seconds the same way he did. We're coming, he said under his breath. Not into the radio. The response came back quickly. A rescue team was spun up. Helicopters were readied. It felt, for a moment, like the machinery of help was finally aligning. Then the weather moved in. It came the way it always did, in those mountains, fast, unapologetic. Clouds rolled over the ridges, swallowing peaks, flattening visibility. Wind shifted. The air turned rough. Harlan watched the shadows crawl over the panels below until they blurred, then vanished entirely. He circled once more, then again, fighting the urge to drop lower than was safe. Bright light is holding. The radio crackled. Conditions deteriorating. Harlan looked at the gauges, looked at the sky. He knew this calculus too well. Negative, he said finally. We can't get them in. Or said. He hated how calm his voice sounded. For hours, he stayed on station as long as fuel allowed, watching cloud cover thicken, hoping for a break. He imagined the men below watching the same sky, feeling the same shift, understanding exactly what it meant. I'm still here, Harlan muttered, circling empty green now. By late afternoon, the call was made. The rescue would not land that day. Harlan turned away from the grid reluctantly, the aircraft banking north. His jaw ached. He realized he'd been chewing air, the gum long gone. That night, he wrote the coordinates again, slower this time. In the days that followed, everything hardened. When weather cleared enough for helicopters to approach again, the ground answered first. Heavy fire walked up toward the aircraft, deliberate, disciplined. It wasn't random. It wasn't hopeful. Harlan watched tracer fire reach up through the canopy and felt the shape of the situation lock into place. "They're waiting," Kid said quietly. "Yes," Harlan replied. "They are." The implication settled between them. Whatever had happened down there, the area was now controlled. The men they'd seen, whoever they were no longer moving panels in the open. A ground team went in when it finally became possible. They moved carefully, methodically, through the same terrain Harlan had memorized from above. When they reached the site, they found no living men. They also found no bodies. No packs laid out, no clear graves. Just disturbed ground, broken vegetation, and the unmistakable feeling that something had happened here and then been taken apart by time, weather, and intention. When Harlan heard the report, he sat very still. "No remains?" he asked. "Negative," came the reply. That was worse, somehow. Official paperwork followed, as it always did. Dates were assigned. Statuses were chosen. Missing in action carried a particular weight. It was both a declaration and a postponement. For Walton's wife, the days stretched differently. She answered the phone too quickly every time it rang. She kept the house running, as if he might still walk through the door, as if routine could keep him anchored somewhere between gone and home. Their son grew older, without knowing why adults spoke carefully around his name. I can't pretend to know what it does to a family to live inside that kind of waiting, but I can see how it turns time into something fragile, how every small sound becomes a possibility you have to survive again. For Harlan, the memory narrowed. 2 figures, panels moving, the exact angle of sunlight on cloth. He replayed it endlessly, wondering if he'd seen hope or something else entirely. "I saw them," he told a colleague once, years later. "They wanted us to see." Well, crime. The radio had stayed quiet. The ground had eventually gone loud, and between those two facts, a space opened that no report could close. The coordinates remained, an address without a body, a place where men had been alive long enough to signal the sky, and then were swallowed back into the jungle, leaving behind only timestamps, pencil marks, and the weight of having been almost reached. For decades, the coordinates existed without gravity. They were spoken, written, underlined, transferred from one form to another, but they did not pull anyone back to the ground. YC 756573 was a location without a body, a reference point that survived longer than memory, but shorter than certainty. The war ended. Governments changed. Families aged. The jungle kept growing. In the early 1990s, something shifted not in understanding, but in access. Files that had been sealed were reopened. Permissions that had once been impossible were now negotiated. The story of Recon Team Asp, once frozen in reports and radio logs, was allowed to move again, not forward, exactly, but back. Dr. Elena Park encountered the case in a way that felt almost accidental. A photocopied casualty summary slid across a metal desk, its edges soft, its language carefully neutral. She read the name slowly. Lewis Clark Walton, 36 years old, at the time of disappearance. Special Forces, Intelligence Specialist. Listed as missing. She paused at the final line, unrecovered. Park had learned that such words were not conclusions. They were placeholders. Invitations, sometimes. Her mentor leaned over her shoulder, reading with her. "People think time closes cases," he said. "It usually just hides them better. Today 1. The first joint investigative team returned to Quảng Nam in the early 1990s, moving on foot through terrain that had never been friendly and had never been empty. The jungle felt older than the war, indifferent to it. Moist heat pressed down. Leaves brushed skin. Insects filled every pause with sound. Villagers watched from a distance. Some remembered the spring of 1971 clearly. Others knew only what had been passed down in fragments. One man spoke through an interpreter, his voice steady but distant. "There was fighting," he said. "Americans." "Where?" Park asked. He gestured broadly toward the hills. "There." Details arrived slowly. Gunfire, aircraft noise, then nothing. When Park asked about burial, the man shook his head firmly. "Kumchon," he said. The interpreter hesitated before translating. "Not buried." The phrase landed heavily. Not buried did not mean forgotten. It meant exposed. It meant rain, animals, and years had been allowed to take part. It meant there would be no grave to open, only scattered traces, where a moment had once existed. Park wrote the words down carefully and underlined them once. Back in the United States, Lewis Clark Walton Jr. received another letter. He recognized the envelope before opening it. Government paper had its own weight. He read it standing at the kitchen counter, one hand resting flat against the surface as if balance mattered. "They're looking again," he said quietly. His mother nodded. She had learned how to wait without asking what came next. Walton Jr. folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with others like it. Drawers had always been part of his life, places where hope lived without making noise. That night, he lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, imagining a place he had never seen but somehow knew. The second field visit brought the first physical signs that the ground might answer. A length of cargo strap lay half exposed along a slope, its fabric stiff, color drained by years of sun and rain. Farther downslope, a uniform button surfaced from the soil, dull and worn smooth. Park held it between gloved fingers, feeling how ordinary it was. "Someone wore this," she said. Her mentor nodded. "Someone stood here." Each find was logged, photographed, flagged. The site did not resolve itself into a neat picture. Instead, it resisted shape, insisting on fragments rather than conclusions. Evenings ended with cicadas screaming as light faded, the smell of damp earth rising again. Park pressed a leaf flat between pages of her notebook one afternoon without thinking. She would find it later, brittle and brown, a reminder that time worked differently here. By the late 1990s, the pattern was unmistakable. Witness accounts aligned with physical traces. The ground did not contradict the story, it complicated it. Walton Jr. was older now, a soldier himself, his understanding of his father altered by his own service. He carried a folded photocopy of his father's face in his wallet, edges softened by handling. He also carried a description passed down carefully through the family, a saint's medallion with airborne wings welded on by hand. "That's his," he told investigators whenever they asked about identifying features. "He made it himself." End quote. Dr. Park returned to Quảng Nam in the mid-2000s with a larger team and a different mandate. This was no longer a survey. It was a commitment. Grid lines were cut through vegetation. Stakes were driven into the ground. The site was divided, measured, restrained. The jungle did not approve, but it allowed it. Workdays blurred together. Soil was moved slowly. Everything passed through screens. Metal rang faintly against wire. Most days yielded nothing that could be named. Patience became the work itself. Then, one afternoon, something resisted the mesh. The sound was wrong, heavier, deliberate. Park stepped in immediately. "Hold," she said. The object emerged gradually, dirt clinging to its surface. Even before it was cleaned, the shape was unmistakable. Wings. A circular disc beneath them. The weld bead uneven, unmistakably human. No one spoke. Park felt the air change around her. This was not just an artifact. It was intention preserved. "That matches the description," she said quietly. The medallion was bagged, photographed, logged. It did not end the work. It deepened it. Thousands of miles away, Walton Jr. answered the phone with hands that suddenly felt too large. "We believe we have recovered a personal item," the voice said. "What kind?" he asked. "A medallion." He sat down slowly, breath leaving him all at once. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to wait that long for something that small, but I can see how an object becomes proof when words have failed for decades." The ground had not given up a story. It had given up a reason to keep asking. The case moved forward, no longer hypothetical, no longer frozen. One name had begun to surface from the earth. The others remained where they were. And above the canopy, the question that had never left still hovered. Who survived long enough to signal the sky, and how long did that waiting last? By the time the case reached the laboratory, the jungle no longer mattered. What arrived in Hawaii were sealed containers, inventory sheets, and signatures written in careful block letters. The chain of custody was unbroken, rigid by design, built to survive scrutiny long after memory failed. Inside the Central Identification Laboratory, the air was cool and stable, the kind of environment created to slow both decay and impulse. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Stainless steel tables reflected faces without expression. Dr. Elena Park paused at the doorway, one hand resting against the frame. She had crossed this threshold many times before, Still, she waited a second longer than protocol required. Once the ground releases something, it becomes the room's responsibility. Inside, the remains were laid out as fragments, not as a person. There was no body to recognize, no outline to assemble, only pieces that had survived heat, moisture, and time long enough to be examined. Each fragment rested on clean paper, tagged, numbered, stripped of context except what science could recover. A junior analyst stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back. "That's everything?" he asked quietly. Park nodded. "It's enough," she said. She did not say what kind of enough. The work began with restraint. Measurements were taken, surface textures examined, break patterns compared against known indicators of trauma and environmental exposure. The conclusions formed slowly, shaped as much by what could not be said as by what could. Long-term surface exposure, degradation consistent with tropical conditions, evidence of violence without reconstructible sequence. There would be no timeline pulled from these fragments, no way to say who moved first or who waited longest. The bones refused to narrate final moments. Park stepped back from the table, arms folded loosely, eyes fixed on what was missing as much as what remained. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to hold proof that cannot answer the questions families carry. But I can see how it teaches humility, how it forces science to move carefully rather than confidently." The personal effects were processed separately, not because they were sacred, but because they were precise. The medallion rested sealed in clear plastic, its weight visible even through the barrier. Airborne jump wings, a round saint beneath them. The weld bead uneven, unmistakably done by hand. No factory process produced marks like that. Park did not touch it at first. She opened the family statement again instead, reading the description written years earlier by a son who had never held the object himself. Hand-welded, worn smooth against skin, always carried. "This isn't generic," a colleague said carefully. "No," Park replied. "It's personal." That distinction mattered. Generic items narrowed possibilities, personal ones closed them. Still, science demanded patience. DNA analysis followed, not with optimism, but with realism. Nuclear DNA had not survived. No one was surprised. The tropical environment had erased too much. Mitochondrial DNA was the remaining path. Maternal lineage, partial sequences, probability rather than absolution. Technicians worked with practiced calm, pipettes clicking softly, machines cycling through their quiet routines. Data accumulated without ceremony. While the lab worked, Lewis Clark Walton Jr. waited again. This waiting did not resemble childhood. It carried the weight of his own years in uniform, his understanding of process and delay. Still, his hands betrayed him. He polished the buttons on his dress uniform once. Then again. He aligned them carefully, as if symmetry could prevent something from tipping over. Someone asked if he wanted water. "I'm fine," he said automatically. In his pocket, he carried a folded photocopy of his father's face, edges worn thin. He also carried the description of the medallion, memorized long ago. Those were the two things he trusted. "Don't tell me unless you're sure," he had said to the liaison officer. "We won't," came the reply. Back in the laboratory, Park reviewed the results as they came in. She cross-checked assumptions. She challenged correlations. She imagined the consequences of being wrong, not abstractly, but in names, funerals, flags, handed to the wrong hands. Misidentification did not just fail science. It transferred grief. "I can't pretend I know what it's like to carry that risk daily, but I can see how it changes posture, how it makes certainty feel earned rather than assumed." When the mitochondrial results aligned, they did so quietly. The sequences matched maternal reference samples provided decades earlier. Not alone, never alone, but in concert with geographic context, associated material evidence, and exclusion of alternatives. Park sat with the file open for a long moment before closing it. "One name," she said softly. No one answered. Lewis Clark Walton. The identification was finalized in December 2006. The language of the report was precise, measured, careful not to promise more than it could prove. Paperwork moved forward through channels, refined by repetition. When Walton Jr. received the call, he did not answer immediately. He stared at the phone, breathing shallowly, as if his body needed time to catch up. "This is Dr. Park," the voice said when he finally picked up. "We have confirmation." He lowered himself into a chair, the movement slow and deliberate. Okay, he said. That was all. After the call ended, he remained seated for a long time. The answer had weight. It did not lift anything. It settled. For Park, the case file closed with a soft sound. One name moved from missing to identified. 2 others remained unresolved. She reviewed the medallion's record once more before shelving it. The object had done what bones could not. It had spoken clearly, once. The reconstruction was sufficient to identify. It was insufficient to explain. Science had answered who. It had not answered how long, with whom, or what choice was made when the sky did not open. Those questions remained behind, unlabeled, unanswered, waiting for the human truth that science alone could not provide. The identification did not arrive like an ending. It arrived like a weight being set down carefully, so it would not crack the floor beneath it. Lewis Clark Walton Jr. sat alone in his car after the call, hands resting on the steering wheel long after the engine had gone cold. The parking lot around him emptied and refilled. He did not notice. He stared straight ahead, breathing slow, as if speed might undo something fragile. Identified. The word should have felt clean. Instead, it felt exacting. When he finally went inside, his wife looked up from the kitchen table and knew without asking. She stood, crossed the room, and put her arms around him. He did not cry. Not yet. They found him, he said. She nodded once. Okay? That was the first night in his life when his father was no longer officially missing. The absence did not vanish. It changed category. The next morning, Walton Jr. ran before dawn, shoes striking pavement in the same steady rhythm he had kept through 2 wars of his own. The air was cool. His breath came out in pale bursts. For the first time, he did not imagine his father as somewhere undefined. He imagined him in a specific place, at a specific point in time, doing something deliberate. That clarity hurt. Arrangements followed. Forms, calls, coordination with offices that spoke in careful, respectful tones. Walton Jr. listened, answered when required, and wrote nothing down. He did not need notes. He had learned long ago how to carry information internally. When the question came about escort duty, he did not hesitate. "I'll bring him home," he said. The officer on the line paused. "Are you sure?" "Yes." The answer felt like a promise finally being kept. At the laboratory, Dr. Elena Park prepared the documentation that would release the remains. She checked every line twice. She did not rush. She understood what happened when precision failed at this stage. Her mentor watched her work, arms folded loosely. "You did good," he said. She shook her head slightly. "We did enough." Enough was the word she trusted most. The transfer was quiet, no ceremony. Just signatures, sealed containers, and a careful handoff. Park stood back as Walton Jr. entered the room, dressed in uniform, posture straight, face controlled. She introduced herself. "I'm Dr. Park," she said. "I know," he replied. "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, both unsure what came next. Park gestured toward the sealed case. "That's him," she said, choosing simplicity over comfort. Walton Jr. stepped closer. He did not touch the container. He looked at it, then nodded once. "I grew up with a blank space at the table," he said quietly. "This doesn't fill it, but it tells me where it was." Park felt her throat tighten. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to meet someone at the end of a case that lasted longer than a childhood, but I can see how the air changes when a name becomes a person again." The flight home was long. Walton Jr. sat beside the remains, hands folded, eyes forward. He did not sleep. He replayed memories, instead real ones, and borrowed ones, assembled from stories told carefully over years. He remembered his mother standing by the phone when it rang from an unfamiliar number. He remembered learning, early, not to ask when his father was coming back. He remembered the medallion description, passed down like a recipe. When the plane landed, he exhaled for the first time in hours. The funeral was scheduled for early May. Spring had arrived in Rhode Island reluctantly. Trees just beginning to bud. Air still cool in the mornings. The church smelled of polished wood and incense. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, scattering color across the floor. Walton Jr. stood near the front, uniform immaculate, buttons catching the light. His hands shook slightly as he clasped them together. He steadied himself by focusing on details, the sound of shoes on stone, the rustle of programs, the slow rhythm of breathing around him. His mother sat in the first pew, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. She had waited most of her life for this day. Now that it had arrived, she looked almost wary of it. When the casket was carried in, the room stood. This wasn't a statistic, Walton Jr. thought. This was someone's father. The chaplain spoke. Words about service, sacrifice, devotion. Walton Jr. listened. But his mind kept drifting back to a cockpit decades earlier, to a man circling coordinates, watching signal panels move. Captain Tom Harlan had not attended the funeral. He did not know if he had been invited. He watched the service later on, a recording sent by a mutual contact. Sitting alone at his kitchen table, he paused the video when the camera lingered on the folded flag. "I saw you," he said aloud, though no one was there to hear it. "I really did." For years, Harlan had told himself that the sighting meant hope. Later, he had wondered if it meant goodbye. Now, he was no longer sure it mattered which. "I saw them," he repeated, softer this time. After the service, Walton Jr. walked to the gravesite with measured steps. The ground was firm beneath his shoes. A light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the smell of fresh earth. When the flag was handed to his mother, he watched her hands close around it. She did not cry. She nodded once, the same way she had nodded when letters arrived, when years passed, when waiting became routine. Later, when it was just family, Walton Jr. lingered. "He tried to come back," he said quietly, "not to anyone in particular. I know he did. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to replace decades of imagining with a single box and a date. But I can see how truth, even when small, reshapes grief, rather than erasing it." In the weeks that followed, Walton Jr. noticed the change in himself. He no longer introduced his father as missing. He said his name plainly. He told his children where their grandfather rested. He could point to a place now. Still, questions pressed in at night. Did his father move the signal panels himself? Was he wounded when he did it? Did he wait, listening for aircraft that never landed? The identification did not answer those things. It clarified the edges and left the center intact. Captain Harlan, watching the recording again weeks later, finally stopped the video at the moment the casket disappeared from view. He closed his notebook, the same one he had used years earlier. Coordinates still written inside. Maybe it wasn't rescue, he said to himself. Maybe it was discipline. The human truth did not resolve the mystery. It reframed it. A man had been there. He had carried something he made himself. He had been alive long enough to matter to the sky. And when the waiting ended, it ended unevenly. One name returned, two still missing. Closure, Walton Jr. realized, was not peace. It was the end of maybe. And that, somehow, was harder than he had expected. The burial gave Lewis Clark Walton Jr. a place to stand. It was not something he'd grown up with. For most of his life, his father existed everywhere and nowhere at once, spoken about carefully, remembered indirectly, never pointed to. Now there was a plot of ground in Rhode Island with a marker set into it, letters cut clean and permanent. He visited alone the first time, early in the morning, when the air was cool and the cemetery quiet except for birds moving through trees. He knelt and brushed a few leaves away from the base of the stone. The grass was damp. His fingers came back wet and cold. "Hey," he said, softly. It felt strange to speak into stillness and have the stillness answer by staying. He stood there longer than he'd planned, thinking about all the places his father had been instead of here. A kitchen table, a riverbank promised but never reached, a jungle hillside where panels had been moved into the open. When he left, he walked backward a few steps before turning away, memorizing the angle of the stone the way he once memorized unit formations. At home, life adjusted slowly. Walton Jr. noticed it in small ways. He no longer hesitated when filling out forms that asked about his father. He no longer corrected people who assumed missing meant unresolved. He told his children plainly where their grandfather was buried. They asked normal questions. He answered them. That mattered. The medallion itself did not come home with him. It remained documented, photographed, cataloged, its job finished, its presence preserved in records rather than hands. Still, Walton Jr. felt it with him sometimes, an imagined weight against his chest when he ran in the mornings, breath steady, cadence familiar. "I know where you are now," he would think, not as comfort, but as fact. Dr. Elena Park closed the case file with deliberate care. She did not stack it with others immediately. She read the name once more before sliding it into the archive. Walton Lewis Clark. Status: accounted for. One line changed. Hundreds remained untouched. She kept the coordinates for the Recon Team Asp site pinned on her wall, a small square of paper among many. Not as a memorial, as a reminder. Only one of the team had been identified. Two others, James Luttrell and Klaus Bingham, were still somewhere beneath the same canopy, their stories unfinished, their objects either gone or still waiting. Park thought about the early assumption people always carried into this work, that finding one meant the rest would follow. That recovery was a domino line. It wasn't. Sometimes recovery redistributed loss instead of resolving it. She returned to Quảng Nam once more before moving on to other cases. Not to dig, just to see. The site was quieter than she remembered. The grid lines were gone. Vegetation had reclaimed the clearings where stakes once stood. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would notice the slight differences in growth, the faint memory of disturbance. She stood still and listened. Wind moved through leaves. Something rustled farther downslope. The jungle had resumed its routines. "This is still a place," she said aloud. "To no one. Just not the kind people imagine. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to close one case while others remain open, but I can see how it teaches restraint, how it keeps certainty from spreading where it doesn't belong." Captain Tom Harlan never returned to the coordinates. He no longer needed to. He kept his old kneeboard in a drawer in his garage. Grease stains still visible, pencil marks faded but legible. Sometimes he took it out and traced the numbers with his finger, not to relive the flight, but to remind himself that he hadn't imagined it. 2 figures, panels moving, a deliberate act. "I didn't make it up," he said once to his wife, years later, when the subject surfaced unexpectedly. She nodded. "I know." Harlan stopped rewriting the coordinates eventually. He stopped circling them in his mind. What remained was the moment itself, fixed and unmoving. He had seen men alive where records would later place death. That mattered, even if it changed nothing else. For Walton Jr., the story settled into something he could carry without flinching. He spoke at a school once, standing in front of students too young to remember Vietnam, as anything but a chapter heading. "My father disappeared," he said. "Then he was found. Those two things are not opposites." A student asked him what it felt like to finally know. He considered the question carefully. "It felt like trading a storm for a map," he said. "The weather doesn't stop. But you know where you are." The other 2 men from Recon Team Asp remained unaccounted for. Their families lived in a different version of waiting, one that did not end with a phone call or a flag. Walton Jr. thought about them often. He mentioned their names aloud when he visited the cemetery, as if proximity might count for something. "They were with you," he said once, standing near the stone. "I haven't forgotten." In the end, what remained was not an answer, but a shape. 1 man returned. 2 did not. 1 object crossed decades of rain and soil to speak once. Others may never do the same. The early assumption that finding Walton would close the case had been incomplete. Finding him proved how much still lay beyond reach. Late one afternoon, Walton Jr. took his children fishing at a small lake not far from home. Nothing dramatic, just a dock, a tackle box, the quiet slap of water against wood. He showed his youngest how to cast, guiding small hands the way his father once guided his. The line arced poorly and landed too close. "That's okay," he said, smiling. "You fix it." As the sun lowered, light caught on something near his collarbone. A chain he wore now, simple, unadorned. The medallion was not there, but the weight of it was. He watched the water ripple outward, where the line touched down, circles expanding, overlapping, fading into the surface. Somewhere far away, under trees that had never learned his name, the ground held what it still held. Here, by the lake, a promise made decades earlier, finally unfolded not as it had been imagined, but as it could be. And that was what remained. Lewis Clark Walton Jr. carries the story differently now, not as a question that follows him everywhere, but as something with edges. His father has a name, a date, and a place his family can stand. Some evenings, he still takes out the folded photocopy he no longer needs and smooths it anyway. Habit lasts longer than waiting. "I know," he says softly, as if the picture might listen. Captain Tom Harlan no longer circles the memory, but it returns without warning when sunlight flashes off metal, when static creeps into a quiet room. For years, he believed seeing the signal panels meant rescue was coming. Now he allows another truth beside it. They wanted to be seen, he says. That mattered. Dr. Elena Park files the medallion's record with care she reserves for objects that carry more than data. She keeps a pressed leaf from Quảng Nam tucked in her notebook, brittle and unchanged. It reminds her that the ground answers slowly, and never completely. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to wait decades for a voice that never comes, but I can see what happens when something finally answers back. The saint on the parachute wing did not explain the last hours. It did not speak for the others still missing. It did one thing, and it did it fully. It proved that someone was there, alive long enough to hope, disciplined enough to signal, and human enough to leave something behind that refused to disappear.